Hello students, welcome to Political Economy 1 of the MOOC. The topic for our discussion today is globalization and the WTO, the World Trade Organization. It is in the fitness of things that we begin by reminding ourselves of the essence of globalization. There are scholars who have referred to liberalization, privatization, and globalization as euphemistic expressions celebrating the high noon of capitalism. So we are basically looking at the intensification of worldwide capitalism and the intensification of interconnectedness that we see in the world today. That is the essence of globalization. Globalization, in fact, has a long history. From the age of pre-modern empire building to the contemporary era of corporate empires. In fact, you can trace the essence of globalization even to the times of Alexander, when he was trying to stretch the contours of the Macedonian Empire. But what is important is that today's globalization operates in a post-socialist framework. Of course, its contemporary articulation and distinctive attributes can be witnessed across several domains, from the cultural to the technological, and globalization in all these domains has contributed to a remarkable politicization of social life. Such developments are most in evidence with respect to political and economic globalization. Contemporary patterns of economic globalization have been strongly associated with a reframing of the relationship between states and markets. So we must try and understand how globalization impacts the state in the world today. Robert Cox has argued that the growing global organization of production and finance had transformed conventional conceptions of government and society, leading to the internationalization of the state. This is basically the process whereby national institutions, policies, and practices become little more than an instrument for restructuring national economies in line with the global capitalist economy. Although this implies that states have lost substantial power over the economy, because we will be witnessing the emergence of multilateral governance across the world and the emergence of several regimes which have kind of eclipsed the state, but the state, of course, we will also see, has not altogether disappeared. But we will come to that in a moment. Although this economic globalization requires a political framework that is provided by the state, notably in the military territorial power of an enforcer, in the modern global economy, this role has largely been assumed by the United States of America. Bob Jessup described the advent of a more market-oriented state in terms of a move away from the Keynesian welfare national state towards what he called the Schumpeterian competition state. The competition state which we see in the world today is a state that aspires to seek economic growth within its borders by securing competitive advantages in the wider global economy. But what is important to note is that although they attempt to increase market responsiveness by promoting entrepreneurialism and labor flexibility, competition states are also aware of the need to combat social exclusion and bolster the moral foundations of society. And that is because globalization is basically about giving more space to private players. And that is why we keep referring to the state withdrawing from the economy and giving more space to private players. But in the process, we also have to be mindful that globalization does not operate over a level playing field, and therefore there are winners and losers. And therefore, it is in the interest of losers that the state has to come up with responses and affirmative action. And that is what is basically referred to in the role of the competition state. But how did this modern globalized economy evolve? The modern globalized economy came into existence in the second half of the 20th century. It was a product of basically two phases. The first phase, which lasted from the end of the Second World War to the early 1970s, was characterized by new arrangements for the management of the international financial system in the post-war period, which became known as the Bretton Woods system. Through a system of fixed exchange rates, regulation, and support, Bretton Woods aimed to prevent a return to a beggar thy neighbor economic policies that had contributed to the Great Depression of the 1930s, and in the process helped to fuel political extremism and aggression. Together with the Marshall Plan, which provided US financial aid to Europe, we know that US had been for a long time following the policy of isolationism, but after the Second World War, it started showing an interest to get involved increasingly in world affairs, and that was paved by the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine. In particular, US extended support for post-war reconstruction in Europe and the wide adoption of Keynesian economic policies aimed at delivering sustained growth. The Bretton Woods system underpinned the so-called long boom of the post-1945 period. In substantially expanding productive capacity and helping to fashion a consumerist form of capitalism, it laid the basis for the later accelerated economic globalization. So what is particularly noteworthy about the post-Second World Order that we witness across the globe? A prominent dimension of the post-Cold War world is the political economy of the present order. Central to it is the degree of stability in the international trading and financial systems. The former remains beset by disputes between the world's three great trading groups or triads and their trading relationship with the developing world. The latter shows periodic signs of undergoing meltdown, as during the financial turmoil that afflicted the East Asian economies towards the late 1990s and the global economy in 2008. This economic order is particularly managed by those elements of governance and institutional bodies such as the International Monetary Fund or the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO, the World Trade Organization. So these institutions has emerged as the global players who constitute the economic apparatus of globalization. They set the tune, and countries across the world who want to be part and parcel of the process of globalization basically are seen to accommodate their policies in line with global currents. And therefore, they play second fiddle to the tune that is set by the institutional apparatus of globalization, economic globalization in particular, represented by the World Bank, the WTO, and the IMF. And that is why we see the emergence of various international regimes, multilateral regimes of governance across the world. The resulting economic order penetrates deeply. Such bodies do not determine just the rules for international trade and borrowing, nor shape exchange rates alone. The full effects of internationalization of production include its impact on the many other things that determine the quality of human lives: production of military equipment, the condition of the environment, social welfare, access to medicines, human and specifically child rights in the area of labor, and gender inequalities in the economy and the processes of development. One remarkable aspect of the order is the extremely dense network of contemporary forms of international governance, regimes, international organizations, and international non-governmental organizations. These cover most aspects of life, including developments in legal, like human rights, war crimes, the International Criminal Court, environmental matters as the UNFCCC and post-Kyoto agreements, and economic regimes, as well as in the core peacekeeping activities of universal organizations like the United Nations. So we really see the emergence of the neoliberal order, whereby the state is keen to leave more space to private players, and that is a phenomenon that we keep referring to, the freeing of markets from states. So what is the central feature of the neoliberal order that has been set in motion by the Bretton Woods system? Since the 1980s, economic development has, to a greater or lesser extent in different parts of the world, taken up a neoliberal guise. Neoliberalism reflects the ascendancy of enterprise capitalism over rival forms of capitalism, its chief belief being a form of market fundamentalism. The neoliberal revolution was, in fact, a counter-revolution. Its aim was to halt and, if possible, reverse the trend towards big government and state intervention that had characterized much of the 20th century and especially the early post-1945 period. This is the phenomenon that we commonly refer to as the withdrawal of the state or the hollowing out of the state. The chief academic exponents of neoliberalism were Hayek and Friedman. A central object of their attack was Keynesianism and the tax and spend policies that they claimed were responsible for the stagflation of the 1970s, a combination of economic stagnation and therefore rising unemployment and high inflation, which is a general rise in the level of prices. The neoliberal solution to the big state that was being gradually discredited was to roll back the frontiers of the state and to give full and at least a much fuller rein to market forces. And this is what we see as the linchpin of the contemporary economic globalization unfolding across the world. Patterns of contemporary economic globalization have woven strong, enduring webs across the world's major regions such that their economic fate is intimately connected. It has been suggested that contemporary financial globalization is a market-driven rather than a state-driven phenomenon. In this context, I would like to also clarify, however, that the role of the state is not completely eclipsed, because scholars like Bhagwati have drawn attention to the fact that what is particularly interesting about contemporary globalization, that it is both technology-driven and it is state-driven. Reinforced by financial liberalization, the accompanying shifts towards markets and private institutions, financial institutions as the authoritative actors in the global financial system, poses serious questions about the nature of state power and economic sovereignty. Are states really the arbiters of the policies that will control the lives of their citizens? Central to the organization of this new global capitalist order is the multinational corporation, which are looked upon increasingly as vehicles of modern-day capitalism. The operations of multinational corporations integrate national and local economies into global and regional production networks. Under these conditions, national economies no longer function as exclusively autonomous systems of wealth creation, since national boundaries are no longer significant barriers to the conduct and organization of economic activity, a phenomenon which is often alluded to through such phrases as a borderless world. So what have been the various responses to this globalization that is taking place in the world? There are different scholars who look at globalization differently. The rise of globalization has stimulated a major debate about the power and significance of the state in a globalized world. There are three contrasting positions that can be identified. In the first place, some theorists have boldly proclaimed that the emergence of post-sovereign governance, suggesting that the rise of globalization is inevitably marked by the decline of the state as a meaningful actor. In this sense, mention may be made of the hyper-globalists who see the state as increasingly hollowing out and as something which has become somewhat redundant. But on the other hand, there are the realists or the skeptics who tend to deny that globalization has altered the core feature of world politics, which is that, as in earlier eras, sovereign states are the primary determinants of what goes on within their borders and remain the principal actors on the world stage. This stand is also difficult to deny if you consider, for instance, the role that all states were involved in times of crisis like the pandemic. But in between these two extreme views, between no state and yes state, there are the transformationalists who occupy a third position, which acknowledges that globalization has brought about qualitative changes in the role and significance of the state and in the nature of sovereignty, but emphasizes that these have transformed the state rather than simply reduced or increased its power. In fact, this is in conformity with what Jagdish Bhagwati says as the managerial role of the state, where the state is seen not just as an usherer of globalization, but also as a manager of globalization, because globalization unfolds differently across different states. Not everybody will have the same consequences emanating from globalization, because all sections of the population are not equally comfortably poised to take advantage of the opportunities unleashed by globalization. So, how exactly is state and the sovereignty that we are talking about impacted by the process of globalization? It is very difficult to argue that the state and sovereignty have been unaffected by the forces of globalization. This particularly applies in the case of the territorial jurisdiction of the state. The traditional theory of sovereignty was based on the idea that states had supreme control over what took place within their borders, over their lives of the citizens, implying that they also controlled what crossed their borders. However, developments such as the rise of international migration and the spread of cultural globalization, which does not really take borders seriously, have tended to make state borders increasingly porous or permeable. This can be seen in the growth of cross-border communications and information flows through various instruments like radio, satellite television, mobile telephones, and the internet, which occur both at a speed and in quantities that defy the capacity of any state to detect them, still less effectively control them. So states definitely have been impacted by economic globalization. Sovereign control over economic life was only possible in a world of discrete national economies. The tendency of national economies to be incorporated to a greater or lesser extent into a single globalized economy renders economic sovereignty somewhat redundant. That is why Susan Strange articulates that where states were once masters of markets, now it is the markets which on many issues are the masters over the governments of states. However, there is a growing recognition that market-based economies can only operate effectively within a context of legal and social order that only the state and the state alone can provide. Moreover, although states, when acting separately, may have diminished capacity to control transnational economic activity, they retain the facility to do so through macroeconomic frameworks of economic regulation as provided by global players like the G20, the WTO, and the International Monetary Fund. Now, it is therefore interesting in this context of globalization, which has been to a large extent facilitated in a post-socialist world and the ascendancy of global capitalism, how the GATT has gradually paved the road to the emergence of the WTO. The World Trade Organization was formed in 1995 as a replacement for GATT, established in 1947. However, GATT only emerged as the basis of the post-war international trading order as a result of the failure to establish the International Trade Organization. The ITO had been proposed in 1945 by the UN Economic and Social Council and would have constituted a full-fledged international organization comparable to the IMF and the World Bank, with powers more in line with those of the later WTO. Its implementation was nevertheless abandoned once President Truman failed to submit its founding treaty, the Havana Charter of 1948, to the US Senate for approval, fearing that the Senate would regard the organization as a threat to the sovereignty of the United States. In a sense, GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, was an agreement amongst member countries to apply the multilateral principles of non-discrimination and reciprocity to matters of trade. This was guaranteed by the requirement that each country had to concede most favored national status to all trading partners. No trading partner could therefore be treated more favorably than any other. So, what were the limitations of the GATT, which gradually paved the road to the emergence of the WTO? GATT regime had various limitations. In the first place, GATT existed only as a set of norms and rules, acquiring the semblance of an institutional character only with the establishment in 1960 of the GATT Council. Its focus, moreover, was restricted to the reduction of tariff barriers against imported manufactured goods. Not only did this mean that agriculture and the growing service sector of the economy were largely off the agenda as far as GATT was concerned, but it also meant that GATT had a limited capacity to check the growth of non-tariff barriers. GATT's procedures for settling disputes between trading partners were also weak. Nevertheless, within these parameters, GATT was highly successful. During its 5th, 6th, and 7th rounds of negotiations, in particular, the Kennedy round, the Tokyo round, and the Uruguay round, tariffs on manufactured goods brought down so substantially that in practical terms, they had almost been eradicated. Whereas average tariffs on the import value of goods in 1947 had stood at 40%, this had been reduced to about 3% by 2000. The final 3 GATT negotiating rounds had further made some progress in tackling non-tariff barriers such as dumping, which is a phenomenon referring to the flooding a market with large quantities of cheap exports in order to weaken the domestic industry, and had started to deal with a wide range of subjects such as services, intellectual property, textiles, and agriculture. Nevertheless, the overall limitations of GATT became increasingly apparent during the Uruguay round, which concluded in 1993 with the proposal to establish the World Trade Organization. So let us zoom in on the basic question as to how did the WTO emerge. In many ways, the emergence of the WTO was a response to the changing imperatives of the international trading system in the 1980s, linked to the wider triumph of neoliberalism that we have already discussed, and the acceleration of globalization. This created stronger pressure to advance the cause of free trade through a more powerful trade organization with broader responsibilities, something akin to the ILO that never was. But the basic premise is that trade is important for development, something that will benefit countries across the world. The broader responsibilities of the WTO were achieved through incorporation not merely of a renegotiated GATT, sometimes called GATT 1994, as opposed to the original GATT 1947, and its framework of agreements concerning manufactured goods, but also agreements on the trade in services and on the protection of intellectual property. This broadening was also evident in the formal recognition of new or hidden protectionism in the form of non-tariff barriers that had particularly bedeviled international trade since the 1970s. So we definitely see a rejuvenation of worldwide trade with the WTO. It is stronger than GATT, particularly in the field of dispute settlement. That we have already seen was one of the basic weaknesses of the GATT. Under GATT, the settlement of disputes required the agreement of all members of a dispute panel, which comprised the members of the GATT Council, as well as parties to the dispute itself. Under the WTO, by contrast, settlement judgments in the case of disputes can only be rejected if they are opposed by all the members of the dispute settlement body to which all member states belong. In effect, this has made the WTO the primary instrument of international law in the matter of international trade. And that is why the WTO has an appeal for the developing countries. The rules of the new organization were also shaped by the interests of key parties to the Uruguay round negotiations. The decision to include agriculture and textiles within the WTO's responsibilities was a concession made to developing countries, which were also in the forefront of campaigning to bring non-tariff barriers within the regime, particularly as these had often been erected by the developed countries. This is why WTO is supposed to be more democratic than its predecessors. On the other hand, developing countries had been particularly keen to extend the trading regime to include services as their economies were becoming increasingly service-oriented, with manufacturing being increasingly transferred from the developed to the developing world. Furthermore, although agriculture was formally brought into the WTO regime, the agreement on agriculture was weak and allowed considerable scope for continued agricultural protection, a matter of particular concern for the USA and the European Union in particular. So the interesting question is, why is globalization such a controversial word today, despite the advantages which it professes? Of course, there is a brighter side to globalization, which scholars have drawn attention to. Stiglitz, for instance, draws attention to the fact that opening up to international trade has helped many countries to grow at a much faster rate than would have been possible otherwise. International trade aids economic development when a country's exports drive its economic growth. In fact, export-led growth was the centerpiece of the industrial policy that enriched much of Asia and improved the plight of millions of people in that huge continent. Globalization has also reduced the sense of isolation felt in much of the developing world and has given many people in the developing countries access to knowledge well beyond the reach of even the wealthiest in any country a century ago. But although globalization has its promises and advantages, there are also disadvantages, and Stiglitz, in fact, draws attention to the seamy side of globalization. It would be a fallacy to consider that globalization is concomitant to development and progress. In fact, to many in the developing world, there has been a widening gulf between the promise and performance of globalization. Stiglitz observes that a growing divide between the haves and the have-nots has left increasing numbers in the third world in dire poverty, living on less than $1 a day. Despite repeated promises of poverty reduction made over the last decade of the 20th century, the actual number of people living in poverty has actually increased by almost 100 million. This occurred at the same time that total world income actually increased by an average of 2.5% annually. The critics of globalization often accuse the Western countries of hypocrisy, and the critics are not altogether mistaken. The Western countries have pushed poor countries to eliminate trade barriers, but kept up their own barriers, preventing developing countries from exporting their agricultural products and so depriving them of desperately needed export income. So the whole question now comes down to whether the WTO should be considered more democratic than the IMF or the World Bank. In some respects, the WTO definitely appears to be a more democratic body than the IMF or the World Bank. Decisions are made within the WTO on a one country, one vote basis and usually require only a simple majority. These rules, in theory, give considerable weight to the views of the developing countries, which constitute more than 2/3 of the WTO's members. However, the WTO is a highly controversial organization which has often been the primary target of anti-globalization or anti-capitalist protests, as in the case of the 1999 Battle of Seattle. So what are the basic criticisms against the WTO? The critics of the WTO observe subtle biases within the decision-making structures that systematically favor developed countries over the developing ones. These include a general emphasis on consensus-based decision-making, which tends to disadvantage developing countries which have no permanent representation at the WTO's Geneva headquarters or have delegations much smaller than those of the developed countries, or they may be excluded from the club-like meetings that are usually dominated by the developed countries. Similarly, developed countries are much more likely to bring issues before the dispute settlement panel and are more likely to offer to serve as third parties able to influence the dispute settlement process, whereas the bulk of allegations of unfair trading practices are made against developing countries. Such subtle biases and the general lack of transparency and accountability in its decision-making process have led to the WTO being described as a rich man's club. Therefore, many accuse that the democratic aspect of the WTO is more a facade, and inside the story is rather different and highly poised in favor of the rich countries. But in this semblance of inequality that we observe unfolding across the world, as I have kept harping on the fact that globalization does not operate over a level playing field, what is the remedy? The opportunities of globalization can surely not be utilized by all sections of the people across the world, and therefore states have to dish out supportive measures to those sections of the population which are not competent to take advantage of the competitiveness ushered in by globalization and such organizations as the WTO. One important area is the role of the transnational movements and NGOs who can sensitize people about various measures at empowerment. Transnational social movements, sometimes called new social movements, developed during the 1960s and the 1970s against the backdrop of growing student radicalism, anti-Vietnam War protests, and the rise of countercultural attitudes and sensibilities. Key examples included the women's movement, the environment or the green movement, and the peace movement. These movements attracted the young, the better educated, and the relatively affluent, and typically embraced a post-materialist ethic. They tended to be more concerned with the quality of life issues and cultural change than with social advancement in the traditional sense. Such tendencies were accentuated by the development from the 1990s of a new wave of social movement activism with the emergence of what has variously been called the anti-globalization, anti-capitalist, and the anti-corporate or global justice movements. This loosely and ideologically diverse movements has been in the forefront of the so-called new politics, stressing decentralization and participatory decision-making and embracing a more innovative and theatrical form of protest politics. Examples have included the Battle of Seattle in 1999, in which mass demonstrations against the WTO, and something I've referred to earlier, degenerated into violent clashes between the police and groups of protesters. So is free trade that is ushered in by regimes as the WTO a boon or a bane? The economic rise of China, which became a WTO member in 2001, and the growing influence of emerging economies such as India, Brazil, Egypt, and South Africa has started to alter balances within the WTO. So these are encouraging developments. This has demonstrated in particular by the stalling of the Doha round of negotiations, which were initiated in 2001, but which were suspended in 2009, largely due to a disagreement over textiles and agriculture, where the US and the EU were unwilling to abandon protectionism. Nevertheless, the main ideological debate about the benefits or otherwise of the WTO centers on its underpinning philosophy of free trade. And free trade is always looked upon as a panacea for all the ills related to underdevelopment. While some argue that free trade brings prosperity to all and in the process make war less likely, others view free trade as blatantly unfair and a cause of structural inequality that continues to plague the world. So how is it basically possible to combat the perils of globalization given that globalization has its seamy side? NGOs can be looked upon as a key player and actor in this regard. Advocacy NGOs have had a variety of high-profile successes, often constraining the influence of TNCs and altering the policy direction of national governments and international organizations. NGO pressure during the UN's Earth Summit in Rio in 1992 combated and contributed to a treaty to control the emission of greenhouse gases. The international campaign to ban landmines, a network of more than 14,000 NGOs working in 90 countries, was effective in 1997 in getting the agreement of some 120 states to ban the production, use, and stockpiling of anti-personnel landmines. The multilateral agreement on investment negotiated by the OECD and aimed at liberalizing foreign investment and reducing domestic regulation was pushed off the political agenda by a sustained campaign of non-governmental organizations. So there can be little doubt that major international organizations and the NGO sector as a whole now constitute a significant group of political actors on the global stage, which can go a long way in combating the perils of globalization and the WTO regime, given that there are undeniable advantages that the WTO can offer to countries across the world to usher in free trade and therefore development.